I came home for Christmas expecting the usual tense family dinner, but the house was completely dark and freezing cold. The only person left behind was my grandfather, sitting silently in his wheelchair in the shadows. I found a note on the kitchen counter from my parents stating they had taken my brother and his wife to Europe for the holidays. The note ordered me to stay behind and change my grandfather's diapers so they could enjoy a luxury vacation without embarrassments. When I turned around to comfort the old man, he stood up perfectly straight, poured 2 glasses of bourbon and handed one to me. He looked me dead in the eye and asked if I was ready to begin. 1 week later, my family returned home and walked straight into a nightmare they never saw coming. If you have ever been treated like the family outcast by people who demand your loyalty but offer nothing in return, hit the like button and subscribe, because this story is for you. The wind howled through the sprawling estates of Buckhead as I pulled my car into the winding driveway of my parents' mansion. It was Christmas Eve, and an unprecedented blizzard had descended on Atlanta, turning the usually pristine neighborhood into a frozen wasteland. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, bracing myself for the evening ahead. At 33 years old, I was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar logistics technology firm, but to my family, I was just Kendra, the disappointment who ran a little delivery service. They constantly reminded me that I lacked the ambition of my older brother, Marcus Jr., the supposed tech genius and golden child of the family. I stepped out of the car and pulled my wool coat tight against the biting wind. There were no holiday lights illuminating the grand facade of the house, no cars parked in the driveway. The entire estate was plunged in darkness. Panic fluttered in my chest. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped into the foyer. The air inside was colder than outside. The heating system had been completely shut off. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing through the cavernous space. No one answered. I walked cautiously toward the living room, relying on the dim moonlight filtering through the large windows. That was when I saw him. Grandpa Elijah sat motionless in his wheelchair, facing the unlit fireplace. A thick woolen blanket was draped haphazardly over his frail shoulders. I rushed to his side, my heart pounding against my ribs. "Grandpa," I said gently, touching his cold arm. "Are you okay? Where is everyone else?" He stared straight ahead, his eyes vacant, giving no sign that he heard me. My family had been claiming for months that his mind was deteriorating rapidly, pushing the narrative that his senility was becoming a burden. I quickly scanned the room and noticed a piece of heavy cardstock resting on the glass coffee table. I picked it up, recognizing my father's precise, arrogant handwriting immediately. "Kendra," the note read. Marcus Jr. closed a massive round of funding for his startup, so we decided to celebrate properly. Brenda, Marcus, Chloe, and I have flown to the Swiss Alps for a luxury ski trip. We knew you could not afford the flights on your meager dispatcher salary, and frankly, we needed someone to stay behind. Your grandfather's condition has worsened, and we cannot trust a hired nurse during the holidays. Keep the house clean, feed him his mashed peas, and make sure he does not soil the good furniture. Do not ruin this for us by being dramatic. We will be back after the new year." Rage burned through my veins, instantly warming me despite the freezing temperature of the room. They had abandoned an 82-year-old man in a house without heat just to flex their fake wealth in Europe. I pulled out my phone and dialed my brother's number, ready to unleash hell. The line clicked open, but the voice that answered belonged to Chloe, his white wife who wore her privilege like a weapon. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," Chloe drawled, her voice dripping with condescension. "We were starting to think you got lost doing one of your little delivery runs." "Where is my brother?" I demanded, keeping my voice dangerously low. "You left a sick old man in a freezing house on Christmas Eve." "Oh, calm down, Kendra." Chloe sighed loudly. "Marcus is busy networking at the hotel bar, and let us be honest, you are better suited for the domestic tasks anyway. Someone had to stay back and change those diapers. Besides, your father specifically said you lack the social grace for an elite trip like this. We are mingling with real investors and diplomats here. Your awkward thrift store energy would just embarrass Marcus." "I own my own company, Chloe," I said tightly. "You are an unemployed former bank teller living off my parents." Chloe laughed a sharp grating sound. Keep telling yourself that, sweetie. Marcus is building an empire while you play delivery driver. Be a good girl and wipe your grandfather's chin. She ended the call before I could respond. I stood staring at my phone as the full weight of their betrayal settled over me. I took a deep breath, pushing down the tears of frustration, and walked back over to the wheelchair. I reached out to adjust the blanket over his knees, but before my fingers could graze the fabric, a strong, steady hand caught my wrist. I gasped and looked up. The vacant stare was completely gone from Grandpa Elijah's eyes, replaced by a sharp, calculating intensity that I had not seen since I was a child. He released my wrist and smoothly pushed himself up from the wheelchair, standing perfectly straight. "They are gone," he said, pouring a glass of bourbon. "It is time to burn their lies to the ground now." I stared at the man I had spent the last 2 years spoon-feeding and lifting into bed. Grandpa Elijah took a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon. The tremor in his hand that usually spilled hot tea all over his lap was completely gone. His posture, once slumped and defeated, now radiated the commanding presence of the man who had built a local construction empire from scratch. "You have been faking it," I breathed out, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. "You remember everything." Every single word he replied, his voice carrying a rich timbre that resonated in the freezing room. I remember Marcus complaining about the smell of my room. I remember Chloe spraying expensive perfume before she would even step near my wheelchair. I remember your mother weeping about what a burden I had become while wearing the diamond necklace she bought with my pension money. He set the glass down on the mahogany table with a sharp clack. "When you are a senile old fool, people treat you like furniture. They talk around you. They leave financial statements lying open on the dining table. They make dirty little deals right in front of you because they think your mind is just a broken hard drive." I watched in stunned silence as my 82-year-old grandfather walked across the dark living room with steady, confident strides. He bypassed the medical equipment my parents had rented just for show and stopped in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling bookshelf. He reached behind a thick leather-bound encyclopedia and triggered a hidden latch. A section of the wood-paneled wall clicked and popped open, revealing a small, hidden safe. He input a code, grabbed a heavy steel lockbox, and brought it back to the coffee table, placing it next to my father's callous Christmas note. "Open it," he instructed, handing me a small brass key. I turned the key and popped the lid. Inside lay thick stacks of legal documents, bank statements, and property records. I picked up the top folder. The header bore the logo of a major national bank. As my eyes scanned the first page, the blood drained from my face. "This is a commercial loan application," I said, tracing my finger over the signature line. "For Marcus Jr. But the collateral listed here is this house." "Look at the dates," Grandpa Elijah urged, leaning forward. I flipped through the pages. The first mortgage was taken out 5 years ago, right around the time I begged my parents to co-sign a small $20,000 business loan for my logistics company. They had told me they were entirely strapped for cash, and that a woman had no business trying to run a supply chain firm anyway. Yet 3 days after they denied me, my father had authorized a $2 million equity line for my brother to launch his tech startup. A startup that produced absolutely nothing but buzzwords and expensive launch parties. I pulled out another stack of papers. A second mortgage followed 2 years later, then a third mortgage dated just 8 months ago. The signatures belonged to both my brother and my father. They leveraged the entire estate. I whispered, the shock morphing into a cold, sharp fury. They put a house that has been in this family for 4 generations on the line to fund his fake lifestyle. Your father could not bear the thought of his golden boy looking like a failure, Grandpa Elijah said bitterly. Marcus Jr. burned through the first 2 million throwing lavish parties, renting luxury cars, and pretending to be Atlanta's next big tech visionary. When the money ran out, Chloe threatened to leave him. So your father stepped in to protect the family image. He co-signed the third mortgage behind your mother's back. They are drowning in debt, Kendra. The luxury ski trip, the designer boots Chloe threw at you earlier today, It is all a desperate charade funded by stolen equity. I sifted through more documents, finding past due notices and final warnings from creditors tightly folded and hidden away. They had projected this image of elite African American excellence to our entire community, posting their European vacations and country club dinners on social media while living on the brink of absolute ruin. I had kept my own massive success completely hidden because I assumed they would just demand I give my earnings to Marcus. I never realized how fragile their empire actually was. We have all the proof we need to expose them, I said, gripping the forged loan documents tightly. I can easily buy this debt right now. We can end this. Before my grandfather could reply, a heavy pounding echoed loudly from the front door. The loud sound cut through the howling wind outside, making us both jump. The pounding came again, louder this time. Nobody visits on Christmas Eve in the middle of a blizzard. I left the documents on the table and walked quickly to the foyer, peering through the frosted window. A man in a heavy parka stood on the frozen porch, clutching a thick manila envelope. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The biting wind whipped snow into the entryway. "Are you a resident of this property?" the man shouted over the storm. "I am Kendra Adams," I replied, shielding my eyes. "My parents own this estate." The man shoved the envelope into my hands. "You have been served," he said, backing away down the icy steps. "Have a very Merry Christmas." I closed the door and ripped open the plastic sleeve, pulling out the stack of legal papers. The bold black letters at the top of the first page jumped off the paper. It was a formal notice of foreclosure. The bank had officially terminated the loan agreement due to non-payment. They were indeed seizing the entire estate next Monday morning without fail. I brought the thick stack of papers back into the living room and dropped them onto the glass coffee table next to the lockbox. Grandpa Elijah leaned forward and picked up the top sheet. He did not look surprised. He simply traced his weathered finger over the bold foreclosure stamp and let out a dry, bitter laugh. "The ruthless bank is moving faster than I anticipated," he said, setting the paper down. "They seized your father's business accounts yesterday," he said. "They fled to Switzerland to run from the angry creditors." I sat down heavily on the edge of the sofa. "They left us here to take the fall." I realized my voice barely above a whisper. They thought the bank would throw us out into the snow without any public humiliation for them. Grandpa Elijah nodded slowly. "But they underestimated who they left behind." He pointed a steady finger back at the steel lockbox. "Look deeper, Kendra. The mortgages are just the beginning of the rot. There is a specific reason Chloe affords those luxury boots." I reached into the box and pulled out a secondary stack of documents bound by a rubber band. They were detailed monthly bank statements from Grandpa Elijah's private retirement accounts spanning 3 years. I flipped through the pages and my stomach churned. There were dozens of consecutive withdrawals, massive wire transfers to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and regular payments to high-end European boutiques, luxury car dealerships, and elite private salons. I looked closely at the signature lines on the authorized transfer slips. The handwriting was a clumsy attempt to mimic Grandpa Elijah's elegant cursive. It was Chloe. As a former bank teller, she knew the internal authorization codes and transfer limits that would avoid triggering fraud alerts. She had been systematically bleeding his savings dry while smiling in his face. "She drained over $600,000, I said, flipping the pages. "She funded her fake socialite lifestyle with your money, and my father allowed it." "Your father knew nothing about this specific theft," Grandpa Elijah corrected. "Marcus Sr. is a fool who mortgaged his legacy to look wealthy, but Chloe is a calculating thief. She preyed on my supposedly declining mental state. When I pretended to forget things, she saw an opportunity. She told your brother she was helping manage my pension. Marcus Jr. was too obsessed with his startup to look into the details. She stole from me right under their noses." Her crime ignited a cold focus within me. The submissive dispatcher vanished. I pulled out my phone and dialed a private, unlisted number I normally only use during top-tier corporate acquisitions. The line rang twice before a crisp professional voice answered. "Harrison Wealth Management, Charles speaking." "Charles, it is Kendra," I said. my tone shifting instantly into the commanding cadence I used in boardrooms. I have an emergency situation that requires immediate forensic attention. Good evening, C.E.O. Adams. Charles replied, his voice sharpening with immediate focus. What do you need? I need your team to run a backdoor trace on a series of unauthorized wire transfers. I read him the account and routing numbers from the compromised statements. The funds were siphoned into a Cayman Islands shell account over 36 months. I want the exact routing history, ownership records, and a list of every merchant transaction. I want it verified, packaged, and legally bulletproof by tomorrow morning. Consider it done, Charles said without hesitation. Do you want me to alert the federal authorities? Not yet, I replied, looking over at my grandfather who was watching me with a mixture of pride and fierce anticipation. I want to build the cage before we lock them inside. I will handle the initial confrontation myself. Have your team prepare the offshore asset seizure documents. If she bought anything with my grandfather's money, I want it frozen. Understood, Charles said. I will have the complete dossier in your secure inbox by dawn. I ended the call. Grandpa Elijah smiled, raising his bourbon in a silent toast. You built an empire while they built a house of cards, he said. I always knew you were the only one in this family with real spine. Your father chased status, your brother chased easy money, but you built real power. I did what I had to do, I replied, pouring a tall glass of ice water. They made it very clear early on that I would never get a seat at their table, so I built my own table. We sat in the freezing living room, the silence broken only by the howling wind rattling the large glass windows. The reality of the situation was settling over the estate. My family was currently halfway across the world drinking expensive champagne funded by theft and fraud, while their ancestral home was days away from being repossessed by the bank. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a sharp, aggressive buzzing. My phone vibrated violently against the glass table. The caller ID flashed brightly in the dark room, illuminating the name Marcus Jr. I stared at the screen, watching it ring. He was calling from Switzerland. Grandpa Elijah raised an eyebrow. The golden child summons you. I took a deep breath and answered the call, putting it on speakerphone so my grandfather could hear every word. Yes, Marcus, I said, keeping my voice submissive and quiet, playing the role they expected. Kendra, finally! My brother snapped, his voice echoing with background noise. Music and the clinking of glasses filled the audio. Listen to me very carefully. I need you to go into Dad's home office right now. Boot up his desktop computer and access the primary business account. We have a minor emergency over here with the hotel concierge, and my cards are temporarily frozen due to an international travel alert. I need you to wire $10,000 to my secondary account immediately. Do not mess this up, and do not tell Dad. I swallowed the burning anger rising in my throat and forced my shoulders to slump. I was physically stepping back into the role of the obedient, invisible sister. I understand, Marcus, I said, pitching my voice an octave higher to sound breathless and anxious. I am walking into Dad's office right now. The house is completely dark and freezing, so I have to find the desk lamp. Nobody cares about the temperature, Kendra, Marcus snapped. The sharp sound of clinking glass echoed through the speaker. Just turn the computer on. I have investors waiting for me at a private table. My black card was declined. Marcus continued. It is humiliating. You need to move faster. In the background, a shrill laugh pierced the audio. It was Chloe. Tell your little helper to hurry up, she sneered. We cannot have the European elite thinking we associate with poor people. Good thing she is finally proving herself as useful help. I looked at Grandpa Elijah. His jaw clenched, but I gave him a curt nod, motioning toward the heavy mahogany doors of my father's home office. We moved quietly down the hallway, the hardwood floors freezing against my thick winter snow boots. I pushed open the double doors and flicked the switch on the heavy brass desk lamp. The warm light illuminated my father's pristine workspace. I am at the computer, I told Marcus, sliding into the leather executive chair. I am turning it on now. It is asking for a password. It is my birthday. Marcus sighed heavily, the irritation dripping from his words. Obviously. Just log into the offshore portal and initiate the transfer. I will text you the routing number. I typed in his birthday, suppressing a bitter smile as the desktop screen flashed to brilliant, colorful digital life. Okay, the portal is loading, I lied smoothly. The internet connection is really slow because of the blizzard outside. Well, refresh it, Marcus demanded loudly. I am not spending my Christmas Eve standing in a hotel lobby looking like a beggar. Fix it now. I muted my phone and placed it gently on the desk. I had zero intention of wiring a single dime to my brother. Instead, my fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the banking portal entirely and opening the main administrative drive of my father's network. Grandpa Elijah wheeled himself up right beside my leather office chair. His sharp eyes scanned the glowing screen. Look for the hidden directories, my grandfather whispered softly, pointing a weathered finger at the monitor. Your father thinks he is a cybersecurity expert, but he uses the same basic encryption for his private communications that he has used for a decade. I nodded, pulling up the system command prompt. Running a logistics tech empire meant I knew exactly how to crack amateur corporate firewalls. I ran a quick decryption script, watching lines of green code cascade down the monitor. Within 60 seconds, a hidden folder materialized on the desktop background screen instantly. It was labeled simply with the current year. I unmuted the phone for a brief second. Marcus, it is asking for a secondary authorization code. It just sent a text to Dad's phone. Are you kidding me? Marcus yelled. Dad is asleep in his suite, and I am not waking him up. Figure it out, Kendra. You work at a computer all day dispatching trucks. Be useful for once in your pathetic life. I muted him again, letting him stew in his own manufactured panic. I clicked open the hidden folder, revealing hundreds of heavily encrypted archived email threads immediately. They were categorized by business contacts and family members. One specific folder caught my attention immediately. It bore my name. My breath caught in my chest as I opened it. The directory contained a massive email chain dated exactly 5 years ago. This was the precise month I had applied for my first commercial loan to launch my logistics company. I had gone to my father's closest friend, a senior vice president at a major commercial bank, asking for a modest $20,000 line of credit. I had a flawless business plan and absolutely impeccable personal credit history records. I had been denied within 24 hours, told my business model was unviable and high risk. That denial had devastated me, forcing me to bootstrap my entire operation while eating ramen noodles and sleeping on the floor of a rented garage. I clicked the first email in the chain. It was sent from my father to the bank vice president. The subject line read, Kendra's application. Read it aloud. Grandpa Elijah commanded, his voice tight with suppressed rage. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes tracing the cruel, calculated words my own father had maliciously typed out carefully. Richard. The email began. My daughter Kendra submitted a loan application to your branch this morning. Under no circumstances is that loan to be approved. Deny her request immediately, and cite a high-risk business model as the official reason. I paused, a cold numbness spreading through my chest. There was a reply from the banker, asking for clarification, noting that my financials were actually incredibly strong. I scrolled down to my father's response, the words hitting me harder than any physical blow ever could hit me in real life. She does not need to be strong, my father wrote. Marcus Jr. is launching his platform next month, and he requires the full financial and social backing of this family. If Kendra succeeds independently, she will overshadow her brother. She lacks the proper image to represent our family's wealth. Crush her application. We need her desperate, compliant, and working a regular job, so she remains available to support Marcus when he needs it. Keep her in her proper place. The screen blurred as tears of pure fury pricked my eyes. My father had literally destroyed my first chance at success, just to force me into subservience beneath my arrogant brother. I stared at the glowing screen as the depth of my father's betrayal settled into my bones. He had not just favored Marcus. He had actively orchestrated my ruin to ensure I would never outshine his namesake. Grandpa Elijah placed a steady hand on my shoulder, grounding me in the freezing office. We spent the rest of Christmas Day in cold, calculating silence, gathering every shred of financial evidence from the network and the lockbox. When the sun rose on the morning of December 26th, the blizzard had finally broken, leaving the streets of downtown Atlanta covered in thick, gray slush. I left my grandfather safely drinking hot tea in my heated luxury SUV and pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors of Harrison Elite Private Banking. The interior was a sanctuary of hushed wealth, featuring imported marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and mahogany desks. I was dressed in a plain, oversized cashmere sweater, faded dark jeans, and heavy winter boots. I did not look like their typical clientele. I approached the main reception desk where a woman with a perfectly structured blonde bob was typing away on a sleek monitor. Her name tag read, Cynthia Regional Manager. She glanced up, and her eyes immediately did a quick, dismissive sweep of my outfit. Her polite smile did not reach her eyes. "Can I help you, miss?" she asked, her tone suggesting I had wandered in to ask for directions to the nearest subway station. Our retail banking branch for standard checking and savings accounts is located 3 blocks down the street. This facility is strictly for private wealth management and commercial acquisitions. I placed my leather tote bag on the marble counter. "I am exactly where I need to be, Cynthia," I said, keeping my voice pleasant but firm. "I am here to discuss a distressed residential asset currently held by this branch. Specifically, I am looking at a third mortgage in default tied to a property in Buckhead." Cynthia let out a soft, patronizing sigh and folded her manicured hands together. "Miss, we do not discuss property foreclosures with unauthorized individuals. If you are a relative of a defaulting client trying to make a partial payment to delay collection, I must inform you that the window for standard remediation has closed. The estate in question is scheduled for immediate seizure next Monday. We are no longer accepting personal checks or payment plans." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a solid titanium black card, sliding it across the cold marble. "I am not here to make a partial payment, Cynthia. I am here to purchase the debt outright. Insert the card into your terminal and let us stop wasting time." Cynthia stared at the heavy metal card, then looked back at my face with a mixture of annoyance and disbelief. She snatched the card and aggressively slid it into the specialized reader attached to her keyboard. I watched her monitor reflect in her wide eyes as the encrypted data populated her screen. Her posture completely collapsed. The smug superiority vanished instantly, replaced by sheer raw panic. The screen displayed my corporate credentials, verifying me as the sole owner and chief executive officer of Apex Logistics Solutions, a holding company with liquid assets that dwarfed the regional branch's entire quarterly quota. "Miss Adams." Cynthia stammered, her voice jumping an octave as she scrambled to stand up from her chair. "I am so incredibly sorry. I had absolutely no idea who you were. Please let me escort you to the VIP conference room right away. I can have our senior acquisition director down here in 2 minutes. Can I get you a sparkling water or a cappuccino?" I waved her off, leaving the card in the reader. "We can handle this right here at the desk," I said. "You have a property in Buckhead listed under Marcus Adams Sr. It holds 3 mortgages, the third of which is critically delinquent. I want to buy that debt right now." Cynthia typed frantically, pulling up the family estate records. "Yes, Mom, the property is heavily overleveraged. The third mortgage alone is for $2.5 million. Standard procedure would be to auction the estate after seizure." "I am not waiting for an auction," I replied, tapping the marble counter. "My holding company will absorb the entire $2.5 million debt today in full cash. In exchange, I want the deed transferred directly to my corporate entity. I want the immediate legal right to the property, and I want the foreclosure proceedings completely nullified under my parents' names, because the house will officially belong to me." Cynthia swallowed hard, nodding vigorously. "Yes, CEO Adams." With a direct cash absorption of this magnitude, we can execute a deed in lieu of foreclosure transfer immediately. It will take me just a few moments to generate the binding transfer agreements and process the corporate wire. I stood in complete silence, watching closely as the heavy industrial printer whirred to life, spitting out thick stacks of freshly printed legal documents. Cynthia handed me a heavy brass pen, pointing to the signature lines. I signed my name methodically, legally stripping my father and brother of the very estate they had used to fund their arrogant delusions. My father had tried to crush my future to protect his fake empire, and now I was literally buying the ground out from under his feet. The banking system chimed loudly, confirming that the massive wire transfer had cleared successfully without any issues. Cynthia carefully gathered all the signed documents and placed them into a thick embossed folder. She slid the folder across the counter along with my titanium card. Her hands were shaking slightly as she slowly looked up at me with absolute deference. She bowed her head respectfully and handed me the finalized deed. "You are now the sole owner of the property, ma'am. What exactly would you like to do with the current tenants?" "Let them stay exactly where they are for now," I told Cynthia, sliding the heavy deed into my leather tote bag. "They are currently enjoying a lavish holiday in the Swiss Alps, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet has vanished. I will handle the eviction process personally upon their return." Cynthia nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and profound respect. She escorted me to the heavy glass doors of the bank, treating me like visiting royalty. I stepped out into the freezing Atlanta slush, feeling a strange new warmth radiating through my veins. The house was mine. The legacy my father had weaponized against me was now legally bound to the very company he had tried to destroy. When I returned to the estate, Grandpa Elijah was waiting in his study. He sat in his leather wingback chair, staring out the frosted window at the sprawling, snow-covered lawn. I handed him the embossed folder containing the transfer documents. He traced the golden seal of the bank with his thumb, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his weathered face. "You actually bought it?" he murmured. "The fortress is officially under new management, but the financial rot extends far beyond this property line. We need to secure the criminal evidence against Chloe before they suspect anything is wrong." I agreed completely. While securing the deed protected our physical sanctuary, we needed to ensure Chloe faced federal consequences for draining his retirement accounts. I opened my laptop and contacted an elite forensic accountant named David. He was a former federal investigator I frequently used to audit potential logistics acquisitions. I granted David full remote access to the encrypted dossier Charles had sent over from Wealth Management. David worked with terrifying speed, slicing through the financial layers Chloe had clumsily constructed to hide her theft. We sat in the quiet study, listening to the rhythmic clicking of my keyboard as David forwarded his preliminary findings to my secure inbox. The offshore Cayman accounts were indeed bloated with Grandpa Elijah's stolen pension funds. However, David flagged a completely separate anomaly that made my blood run cold. There was a secondary stream of illicit income flowing directly into Chloe's hidden accounts. This stream was steady, consisting of smaller, untraceable deposits made every single Sunday afternoon for the past 2 years. I opened the routing attachments David provided. The domestic origin account belonged to Grace Fellowship Church. It was the specific charity fund designated for underprivileged youth programs. My mother, Brenda, was the head treasurer of that exact committee. She had held that prestigious volunteer position for over a decade, using it to elevate her social status among the wealthy congregation. "Look at these authorization signatures," Grandpa Elijah said, leaning over my shoulder to inspect the glowing screen. "Chloe is listed as the assistant financial coordinator for the charity." The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Chloe had not just embezzled from my grandfather. She had been systematically skimming thousands of dollars from the church charity fund. She used her position as assistant coordinator to manipulate the ledgers, transferring small chunks of donation money directly into her Cayman Island shell company. She knew Brenda was notoriously terrible at bookkeeping, and relied entirely on her golden daughter-in-law to manage the digital spreadsheets. My mother blindly trusted Chloe, completely convinced that Marcus Jr. had married the perfect upper-class socialite. Brenda loves to brag to her elite prayer group about Chloe's designer wardrobe, I said, shaking my head in absolute disgust. She thinks Chloe comes from generational wealth. She has no idea those diamond earrings and silk scarves were purchased with money stolen from starving children. She is funding her lavish lifestyle with stolen charity money, while your mother looks the other way. Grandpa Elijah growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. When the federal authorities audit that church fund, Brenda will go down with her. As the head treasurer, she is legally responsible for every missing penny. Chloe has perfectly positioned your mother to take the fall for federal wire fraud and grand larceny. I watched the screen as David finalized the comprehensive data dump. He had isolated every forged signature, every offshore transfer, and every fraudulent ledger entry Chloe had created. He compiled the irrefutable evidence into a single heavily encrypted file. I pulled a sleek silver flash drive from my desk drawer and plugged it into the encrypted port. I dragged the massive file onto the drive, watching the progress bar slowly fill. This tiny piece of metal now held the power to completely decimate my brother's fake marriage and send his precious wife to federal prison for a very long time. The progress bar chimed, indicating the transfer was 100% complete. I pulled the flash drive free and held it up to the light. It was the ultimate weapon. We had the deed to the estate proving their absolute financial ruin. We had the emails proving my father's malicious sabotage. And now we had the undeniable forensic proof that their beloved daughter-in-law was a common thief stealing from the church. Just as I dropped the silver flash drive safely into my pocket, the screen of my phone lit up with a harsh, bright glare. It was a new text message. The sender name displayed was Brenda. I stared at the phone, feeling a profound sense of pity mixed with sharp revulsion. My mother was currently sitting in a 5-star luxury ski lodge, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire reality had just been legally dismantled. I swiped the screen open to read her message. The text was demanding, arrogant, and entirely devoid of any warmth. Make sure you scrub the master bathroom. Chloe's parents are visiting for New Year's dinner the day we get back, and we need the house spotless. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, reading my mother's arrogant demand one more time. The sheer audacity of her text message perfectly encapsulated her entirely distorted reality. She was actively ordering me to scrub toilets on my hands and knees in preparation for a lavish dinner party, while her precious daughter-in-law was systematically stealing from the very church fund my mother proudly managed. I pocketed the phone and looked up at my grandfather. We have exactly 6 days until they return from their European vacation, I told him. We need to clear out everything that actually matters to you before they walk back through those doors. Grandpa Elijah nodded firmly, pushing his wheelchair toward his private quarters. The following week became a masterclass in quiet, calculated extraction. We worked late into the night, meticulously packing away decades of irreplaceable family history. I carefully wrapped his vintage pocket watches, the antique silver cufflinks he wore to my grandmother's funeral, and the original leather-bound ledgers from when he first started his construction company. We left the bulky, gaudy furniture my parents had purchased to impress their country club friends. We only took the items that held true sentimental value and quiet dignity. I hired a discreet private transport service to move the boxes under the cover of darkness. We did not take them to a modest suburban apartment or a cheap storage unit. Instead, the armored transport van drove straight into the heart of the city, arriving at the secure underground parking garage of a premier residential high-rise. My actual home was a sprawling $12 million dual-level penthouse overlooking the entire Atlanta skyline. I had purchased it in cash 2 years ago under a blind corporate trust. My family firmly believed I lived in a cramped studio apartment on the wrong side of the tracks because that narrative suited their desperate need to feel superior. Grandpa Elijah wheeled himself out of the private elevator and into the massive marble foyer of my penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the glittering city lights. He slowly took in the custom Italian furnishings, the modern floating staircase, and the expansive open-concept living area. You certainly kept your success well hidden, Kendra, he murmured, a proud smile softening his weathered features. They spent all their time and stolen money pretending to be royalty while you quietly built a legitimate empire right above their heads. This place is absolutely magnificent. I settled him into this primary guest suite, which was larger than my parents' entire master bedroom back at the estate. I arranged for a private around-the-clock nursing staff to ensure his medical needs were met without relying on the cheap rented equipment my parents had dumped in his old room. Once he was secure and comfortable, I drove back to the sprawling suburban estate to finish preparing the ultimate trap. The bank owned the physical structure now, but I needed to ensure the upcoming confrontation was captured flawlessly. My legal team required irrefutable proof of their reactions when the truth finally dropped. I spent 48 hours carefully wiring the main entertainment spaces of the house with expensive state-of-the-art surveillance technology. Using the skills I developed managing high-security warehouse logistics, I embedded tiny high-definition cameras directly into the ornate crown molding of the formal dining room. I strategically hid a secondary wide-angle lens behind the massive crystal chandelier, ensuring a perfect and completely unobstructed view of the long mahogany dining table. In the main living room, I installed motion-activated audio and video recorders inside the custom bookshelf directly facing the imported Italian leather sofas where my father liked to hold court. I ran rigorous complex tests on the encrypted server feeds, ensuring the audio captured every single arrogant whisper perfectly, without any static or delay whatsoever. I spent the final day walking through the empty, echoing house. The silence felt heavy with the weight of impending destruction. I did not bother scrubbing the master bathroom or polishing the silver as my mother had demanded. I simply waited. The trap was set, the bait was placed, and the cage door was wide open. I sat quietly at the marble kitchen island nursing a hot cup of strong black coffee and reviewing the forensic accounting files one last time. The numbers told a story of absolute greed and breathtaking stupidity. They had traded their legacy for cheap applause and temporary status. According to my arrogant mother's original text message, the family was not scheduled to arrive until the following evening. I had planned to spend the night reviewing my corporate acquisition strategy for the upcoming quarter. However, the universe had a different schedule in mind. At exactly 4:30 in the cold afternoon, the heavy brass handle of the front door clicked sharply. The heavy deadbolt suddenly slid back with a loud metallic thud. Heavy footsteps echoed loudly against the marble entryway, followed immediately by the chaotic sounds of rolling luxury luggage and loud complaining voices. They had returned from Europe a full 24 hours early. "Kendra, get out here right now," my father's voice boomed loudly through the foyer, carrying his usual irritating tone of absolute authority. "Grab these heavy bags and take them upstairs immediately." "Why is it freezing in here?" Chloe whined, her voice piercing the quiet atmosphere. I explicitly told her to have the heat turned up before we arrived. She is completely and utterly useless to this entire family as always. My mother sighed loudly, dropping her heavy, expensive mink coat onto the wooden entryway bench. "Do not ever expect any level of competence from her, Chloe. Just go upstairs and check the master bathroom and make absolutely sure she actually scrubbed the grout like I told her to do. If it is not completely spotless, she is definitely staying up late and doing it all over again." The heavy door swung open, revealing Marcus Jr. and his wife Chloe. They stomped into the foyer, bringing a flurry of frigid air and melting snow. Chloe was draped in an oversized white fur coat that made her look like a walking avalanche. She kicked off her winter boots, sending them skidding across the polished marble floor. One heavy boot slammed directly into the kitchen island where I was sitting. "Clean those immediately," she snapped, not even bothering to look in my direction. "The suede needs to be treated with that special conditioning oil. And do not use the cheap brush. They are custom-made from Milan, and I will not have you ruining them." Marcus Jr. let out an exhausted sigh, tossing his travel duffel onto the entryway rug. He rubbed his temples with an exaggerated display of fatigue. "God, I am so jet-lagged," he groaned, complaining to absolutely no one. "Kendra, grab the bags from the driveway right now. It is freezing out there, and I am not risking frostbite to haul luggage." Have the kitchen staff whip up hot cider and bring it to my study. I have deals to finalize before tomorrow morning. I remained seated on the velvet bar stool, calmly sipping my black coffee. I did not flinch. I did not scramble to apologize. I did not move a single muscle toward the snowy boots or the luggage waiting outside in the slush. The hidden cameras embedded in the crown molding above us were capturing every glorious second of their ridiculous entitlement. The lenses were recording every sneer and the audio was picking up every arrogant demand. It was a flawless symphony of self-destruction. I am not cleaning your boots. Chloe, I said, my voice dangerously quiet but echoing clearly through the foyer. And I am not fetching your luggage, Marcus. You are perfectly capable of walking back outside and carrying your own bags. The foyer went dead silent. The absence of noise was deafening. My mother Brenda froze with her hand halfway out of her mink coat sleeve. Chloe lowered her designer sunglasses, staring at me as if I had spoken in a dead language. Marcus Jr. took a step back, blinking in pure disbelief. It was as if the concept of me saying no was incomprehensible to their egos. My sudden defiance broke their carefully constructed reality. "Excuse me, my father." Marcus Sr. roared, stepping out from the hallway shadows, his face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He marched toward the kitchen island, his winter boots leaving wet, muddy tracks across the imported rugs. "What did you just say to your brother?" I took another slow sip of my coffee, letting the mug clink softly against the marble countertop. "I said I am not their servant," I repeated, enunciating every syllable with crystal-clear precision. "I am not hauling bags and I am not scrubbing boots. If you want cider, you know where the kitchen is." Marcus Sr. slammed his massive hand down on the island, causing my coffee mug to rattle. "You ungrateful little brat," he snarled. "You live under my roof. You eat my food. You breathe my air. You are a failure, a disgrace to the family name. While your brother is closing million-dollar acquisitions, you sit around drinking coffee, refusing to contribute." He leaned in, his face contorted. "You have achieved nothing, Kendra. You have no career. You have no prospects. You are a disappointment and will do exactly as you are told. Get outside and get those bags before I throw you out." I stared into his eyes, feeling no fear. The little girl who used to cower at his voice was dead. The woman sitting before him legally owned the ground he threatened to throw me off. I owned the walls that echoed his shouts and the roof he claimed shielded me. "You are right about one thing," I replied smoothly. "This household is definitely on the verge of a major transition." Chloe scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes and crossing her arms. "She is losing her mind," she muttered to Marcus Jr., loud enough for the hidden microphones to pick up perfectly. "I told you we should not have let her stay while we were gone. She spent the whole week wallowing in self-pity. Just fire the brat and hire a real maid service. I cannot stand looking at her depressing face anymore." Marcus Jr. nodded, adjusting his cashmere sweater with a smug look of superiority. "Seriously, Dad, she is becoming a massive liability. We have investors coming over this weekend. We cannot have Kendra lurking around acting like a petulant child, refusing basic instructions. It makes us look bad." My mother Brenda stepped away from the coat rack. She smoothed down her tailored skirt and walked toward the kitchen island with a predatory smile. She looked at me with a chilling, calculated indifference. She opened her leather handbag and pulled out a glossy tri-fold brochure. She slid it across the counter, stopping next to my coffee mug. "Actually, Marcus is right," Brenda said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "It is time for a major transition. Since you cannot handle household responsibilities without throwing a tantrum, we are making permanent changes to the living arrangements." I glanced down at this brochure. The cover featured a stock photo of a bleak, sterile building. The bold text read, "Sunset Pines State Assisted Living Facility." My heart stopped. I recognized the name immediately. It was an underfunded, run-down government facility meant for destitute wards of the state. It was a dark place where people were sent to be entirely forgotten. I felt a surge of protective fury boiling inside my chest. Brenda stepped forward, handing me a brochure for a state-run low-income nursing home. "Pack your grandfather's things. The transport van is coming tomorrow to take him away, so Marcus Jr. and Chloe can have his wing of the house." I stared down at the glossy pamphlet resting next to my coffee mug. The cheap thin paper advertised a nightmare of fluorescent lights and linoleum floors. Sunset Pines Assisted Living. A literal dumping ground for the forgotten. A year ago, this blatant cruelty would have shattered me. I would have begged, pleaded, and bargained with them to let my grandfather stay in the only home he had known for 40 years. I would have offered to pay rent to take on more chores, to shrink myself even smaller to accommodate their staggering egos. But sitting there under the invisible gaze of my hidden cameras, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, razor-sharp amusement. I did not yell. I did not throw the brochure back in her perfectly contoured face. I simply looked up at my mother and smiled. It was a slow, terrifyingly calm smile that caused Brenda to take a sudden, involuntary step backward. "What is so funny, you insolent little brat?" Marcus Sr. barked, stepping forward to flank my mother. "You think this is a joke? Your grandfather requires round-the-clock medical supervision that we are no longer willing to subsidize. He is a drain on our resources and a constant depressing presence in this estate." Chloe scoffed, crossing her arms tightly over her absurd white fur coat. "Exactly," she chimed in. "We have elite investors and foreign dignitaries flying in next month for a massive capital campaign. I cannot have some senile old man wandering the halls in a bathrobe mumbling to himself while I am trying to serve champagne and caviar. It ruins the entire aesthetic of the property." Marcus Jr. nodded in vehement agreement, loosening his silk tie. "His wing of the house is completely wasted space, Kendra. Chloe and I need a proper primary suite and a dedicated nursery for when we decide to expand our family. Putting him in a state facility is the most logical financial decision. The transport van will be here at 8 tomorrow morning. Have him packed and ready by the front door." I kept the smile plastered on my face, letting their disgusting justifications hang heavily in the tense air. I did not need to defend my grandfather. I did not need to scream about their utter lack of humanity. The timing was already orchestrating itself perfectly. The rhythmic clinking of a ceramic spoon stirring against fine china echoed softly from the shadowed archway of the kitchen. The sound was steady, deliberate, and completely unhurried. Every single head in the foyer snapped toward the noise. The heavy swinging door pushed open and Grandpa Elijah walked into the light. He was not slouched over a walker. He was not confined to the battered medical wheelchair my parents had forced him to use for the past 2 years. He stood perfectly straight, his broad shoulders squared and his chin held high. He wore a crisp, tailored navy suit and polished Oxford shoes, looking exactly like the ruthless corporate titan who had built this family legacy from the ground up. He held a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea in his steady right hand. The absolute horror that washed over my family was visceral. Brenda let out a strangled gasp, clutching her throat as if she had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. Marcus Sr. went entirely rigid, his face draining of all color, until he looked like a wax statue. Chloe took 2 rapid steps backward, bumping into a console table and nearly knocking over an expensive porcelain vase. Marcus Jr. simply stared, his jaw practically unhinged, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it bordered on comical. They had spent the last 24 months convincing themselves and everyone else in their elite social circles that Elijah was a deteriorating invalid suffering from advanced dementia. They had relied entirely on that carefully fabricated narrative to systematically strip away his assets, steal his retirement funds, and assert total dominance over his estate. Seeing him standing there sharp and commanding shattered their entire reality in a fraction of a second. Grandpa Elijah took a slow sip of his tea, his piercing blue eyes locking directly onto my father. The temperature in the room plummeted. The silence was so absolute you could hear the distant howling of the winter wind, rattling against the frosted window panes. He lowered his teacup and set it gently onto the marble kitchen island right next to the nursing home brochure. When he finally spoke, his voice did not quaver or shake. It resonated with perfect, terrifying clarity. "The only people leaving this house tomorrow are the parasites who mortgaged it behind my back." My father swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat forming on his temple despite the freezing temperature outside. "Dad, you are confused," he stammered, taking a cautious step forward, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. Your medication must be wearing off. Let us get you back upstairs to your bed. You do not know what you are saying. Do not insult my intelligence. Marcus, Grandpa Elijah, snapped, his voice cracking like a leather whip. I know exactly what I am saying. I know about the 3 leveraged mortgages you secretly took out against this estate to fund your failing shell companies. I know about the offshore Cayman Island accounts Chloe has been using to drain my pension. And I know that this property officially belongs to your daughter, because you were stupid enough to default on the final loan. My mother let out a shrill, panicked cry. She looked frantically between me and my grandfather, her carefully constructed high society persona dissolving into raw, frantic desperation. It is a lie, she shrieked, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at me. She is poisoning his mind. She has been manipulating him while we were in Europe. The walls were closing in on them, and the sheer panic of impending exposure was making them reckless. Marcus Jr. realized the devastating implications of his grandfather's absolute lucidity faster than the rest of them. If the old man was of sound mind, their entire financial house of cards was instantly obliterated. The federal wire fraud, the forged signatures, the stolen charity funds, everything was about to collapse directly onto his shoulders. His face contorted into a mask of pure, desperate rage as he completely lost his grip on reality. He is crazy! Marcus Jr. screamed, a wild, feral look taking over his eyes as he dropped his expensive leather duffel bag to the floor. He has lost his mind. He is hallucinating. He lunged forward across the marble foyer, his hands outstretched, reaching violently toward his grandfather, shouting that the old man was a danger to himself and needed to be physically restrained immediately. I stepped squarely into his path, blocking his frantic charge with my own body. I shoved my hands hard against his cashmere-clad chest, forcing him to stumble backward onto the imported rug. He swung his arms wildly, trying to push past me, but Grandpa Elijah did not flinch or retreat a single inch. My grandfather stood like an immovable monument of granite, watching his namesake unravel into a pathetic, screaming mess. The sudden physical resistance seemed to snap Marcus Jr. out of his immediate violent frenzy, but his chest still heaved with panicked breaths. He pointed a trembling finger at the old man, spewing vile threats about calling a psychiatric ward to have him committed by force. He demanded that we contact the authorities to drag the crazy old fool out of the house in a straitjacket immediately. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out the thick embossed folder Cynthia had handed me at Harrison Elite Private Banking. The heavy brass pen I had used to sign their ruin away was still clipped to the inside pocket. I walked past my brother, ignoring his hysterical rambling, and moved directly into the formal living room. The rest of the family instinctively followed me, drawn by the undeniable gravity of the situation. They gathered around the expensive glass coffee table like moths circling a dying flame. I raised the heavy folder and slammed it down onto the glass surface. The sharp, explosive smack echoed through the vaulted ceiling, instantly silencing my brother's frantic shouts. The sudden noise made Chloe flinch violently, her hands flying up to cover her ears in absolute shock. "What is this nonsense?" Marcus Sr. demanded, marching over to the table. He snatched the folder with aggressive force, tearing it open. His eyes darted across the bold legal print of the top document. I watched closely as the blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw slackened and the paper began to tremble violently in his grip. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a sudden terrifying realization. But true to his arrogant nature, he immediately tried to spin the narrative. He forced a hollow, booming laugh that sounded more like a death rattle. He desperately wanted to maintain the illusion of control in front of his precious golden son and his terrified wife. "This is a massive administrative error," he announced, turning to face my mother and Chloe. "Harrison Elite has clearly made a clerical mistake. You know how these automated banking systems operate, Brenda. They generate these ridiculous notices all the time. I will have my corporate attorneys call the regional manager tomorrow morning and have this entire misunderstanding cleared up before lunch. There is absolutely nothing to worry about here, so just calm down." I did not let him finish his pathetic attempt at gaslighting the room. I cut him off sharply, my voice slicing through his desperate lies. There is no bank error, and there are no corporate attorneys left to call, I stated, watching his fake smile collapse. I spent yesterday morning in the VIP conference room at Harrison Elite, reviewing every single page of those documents. I know exactly what you did. You did not just take out a third mortgage to keep your failing shell companies afloat. You deliberately co-signed 3 separate fraudulent loans, using this estate as collateral, while explicitly forging my grandfather's signature on the primary guarantor lines. You leveraged the only home he has ever owned to artificially inflate your own completely bankrupt portfolio, and you did it knowing you could never repay a single dime. Brenda gasped, clutching the back of the velvet sofa as if her legs had suddenly lost the ability to support her weight. She stared at her husband, waiting for him to unleash his usual righteous fury and deny the horrific allegations. But Marcus Sr. remained absolutely silent. He stared down at the documents, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a suffocated fish. Chloe let out a sharp, frantic breath, backing away from the coffee table. She looked at the luxurious surroundings, the crystal chandeliers, the priceless artwork, and the imported rugs as if they were suddenly turning to dust right in front of her eyes. She realized the lavish lifestyle she had married into was entirely funded by criminal fraud and staggering debt. "Look at page 4, I commanded, pointing directly at the trembling papers in my father's hands. It details the exact timeline of your defaults. You missed the remediation window 6 months ago. You ignored the final collection notices because you were arrogant enough to believe the bank would never actually seize the primary residence of the great Marcus Adams. You thought your country club connections and your golf buddies on the executive board would protect you from standard foreclosure proceedings. But the private wealth management division does not care about your fake social status. They only care about liquid assets, and your accounts have been entirely empty since last November." The absolute finality of my words settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. The grand patriarch of the Addams family had been officially exposed as a desperate fraud. His entire empire was nothing but a hollow illusion built on stolen equity and forged signatures. The house they had just walked into demanding to be served was completely out of their hands. The crushing silence was suddenly broken by a sharp, nervous laugh. Marcus Jr. stepped forward, stepping over the invisible line of utter defeat his father had just crossed. He adjusted the heavy gold Rolex on his left wrist, a nervous habit he developed whenever he felt cornered. He puffed out his chest, trying to project an aura of absolute dominance that directly contradicted the terror in his eyes. "So what?" he scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. "My startup just closed a massive deal. I will just buy the house from the bank myself." Marcus Jr. laughed again, his voice a pitch higher this time. It was the sound of a man trying to convince himself his own delusions were real. "I have investors lined up around the block," he boasted, straightening his posture. "We are talking 8 figures minimum. I can write a check to Harrison Elite tomorrow and clear this entire mess up. You are playing a stupid game, Kendra, but I actually have the capital to end it." I did not argue with his pathetic display of bravado. I simply reached into my tote bag and pulled out my silver iPad. The formal living room featured a massive 85-inch smart television mounted above the marble fireplace, designed specifically for Marcus Sr.'s lavish Super Bowl parties and corporate presentations. With 2 quick taps on my screen, I synced my device to the television. The giant black rectangle flared to life, illuminating the dimly lit room with a harsh, glaring spreadsheet. "What are you doing?" Brenda demanded, her voice shrill with rising panic. "Turn that off immediately. We do not need a visual aid for your petty jealousy." I ignored my mother, stepping to the side so everyone had a perfectly unobstructed view of the screen. "Look closely at the top left corner," I instructed, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "That is the official year-to-date operating statement for your precious son's startup. You know, the revolutionary tech company you all bragged about to your country club friends while mocking my career choices." Marcus Jr. froze. The smug, confident sneer completely melted off his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He stared at the screen as if it were a physical monster coming to devour him. "Let us break down this massive deal you just bragged about," I said, swiping my screen to highlight a column of devastatingly negative numbers. "According to your own chief financial officer, your company has generated exactly $0 in actual revenue over the past 14 months. You burned through your initial venture capital funding in less than half that time. And where did that money go? It certainly did not go into product development or engineering." I swiped again, pulling up a detailed expense report. The red text on the massive screen felt like a physical blow to the room. It went into leasing luxury sports cars for your executive team. It went into renting a penthouse office space downtown that you did not need. It went into funding all-inclusive trips to the Bahamas for your so-called networking events. You even used company funds to purchase that gold Rolex currently sitting on your wrist. Chloe whipped her head around to stare at her husband, her perfectly glossed lips parted in absolute horror. "Marcus," she gasped, her voice trembling. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not drain our personal savings to cover up a bankrupt company." He could not even look at his wife. He kept his eyes glued to the television screen, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw breath. "Oh, it gets much better," I continued mercilessly. "Because your creditors finally caught up with your little charade. 3 weeks ago, your board of directors forced you into an emergency liquidation to avoid facing federal embezzlement charges. You did not close a massive deal, Marcus. You signed a desperate fire sale agreement to offload your assets for pennies on the dollar just to keep yourself out of a federal penitentiary. You are completely bankrupt." Brenda let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. She rushed toward Marcus Jr., wrapping her arms around his rigid shoulders, as if her physical presence could somehow shield him from the undeniable truth displayed on the wall. "It is just a temporary setback," she cried out, glaring at me with raw hatred. "Startups struggle all the time. Your brother is a brilliant entrepreneur, Kendra. He will bounce back from this. He just needs a bridge loan to restructure his assets." "There are no assets left to restructure," I replied smoothly, my voice cutting through her hysterical denial. "And there is no bouncing back from what happened yesterday morning." I tapped the iPad screen one final time. A new document appeared on the television. It was a formal bill of sale complete with legal seals and digital signatures. The document detailed the complete acquisition of Apex Solutions, the entirety of its intellectual property, its physical hardware, and its remaining client contracts. Marcus Sr. squinted at the screen, his eyes tracing the lines of the legal document. He read the name of the acquiring company aloud, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Vanguard Logistics. What does this mean? Who is Vanguard Logistics?" I took a slow, deliberate step toward the center of the room. I let the silence stretch, ensuring that every single person in the room was hanging on my next words. "Vanguard Logistics is the firm I founded 3 years ago," I stated, watching the absolute shock detonate across my father's face. "The company I built from the ground up while you all sat around this very table mocking me for refusing to join the family business. The company you called a cute little hobby. Vanguard is now the premier supply chain tech firm on the eastern seaboard." The air in the room grew completely stagnant. My grandfather Elijah watched me from the kitchen archway, a rare expression of profound pride softening his weathered features. "I am the anonymous buyer, Marcus," I said, turning my gaze back to my brother. "I purchased your liquidated company through a proxy firm. I bought your entire life's work for less than the cars you leased. Every single line of code and every single corporate server you thought you controlled now belongs exclusively to me." I stepped closer to my brother, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I don't just own this house, Marcus. I own your servers, your patents, and the very chair you're sitting on." The color rapidly drained from Marcus Jr.'s face, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out mannequin. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed heavily into the very leather armchair I had just informed him I owned. The smug superiority that had defined his entire existence vanished completely, replaced by the vacant stare of a man watching his entire universe burn to the ground. He looked down at his shaking hands as if he no longer recognized them. My mother Brenda could not handle the sudden shift in power. Her perfectly manicured reality was shattering into jagged pieces, and the sheer terror of public humiliation finally broke her composure. She began to hyperventilate, her chest heaving violently under her tailored silk blouse. She stumbled forward, placing her trembling hands on the glass coffee table, as if trying to physically block the glowing television screen from existence. "Stop it!" she gasped, her voice cracking into a frantic, high-pitched whine. "Turn that screen off right now, Kendra. You have made your point. You have had your little revenge, but this has gone far enough. We are a respectable Christian family. Think of our reputation. Think of what the congregation will say if any of this gets out into the community. You are going to ruin the Adams name forever." I did not blink. I did not soften. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire childhood treating me like a burdensome stain on her perfect social calendar. The audacity she possessed to invoke our family reputation and her fake religious piety in the same breath was genuinely astounding. A respectable Christian family, I repeated the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. That is a fascinating choice of words, Brenda. Let us talk about your unparalleled Christian charity. I tapped the screen of my iPad twice. The devastating corporate bankruptcy documents vanished from the 85-inch television. They were instantly replaced by a meticulously organized Excel spreadsheet topped with the gold-embossed logo of the Grace Fellowship Church. It was the exact same congregation my parents had attended for 3 decades, the same church where Brenda proudly served as the head of the Community Outreach and Finance Committee. My mother's eyes locked onto the glowing logo, and a sharp, terrified squeak escaped her throat. She took a step back, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Her perfectly styled hair seemed to tremble as a cold sweat broke out across her forehead. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the television. "I am answering your plea to think of the congregation," I replied, my voice echoing with icy precision. "This is the master ledger for the Grace Fellowship Orphan and Widow Relief Fund, a fund you personally oversee, a fund designed specifically to help the most vulnerable and destitute members of our community pay for winter heating, groceries, and emergency medical bills." I swiped my finger across the glass tablet, highlighting a series of massive withdrawals marked in bright crimson. According to the internal audit I commissioned last week, exactly $75,000 has vanished from this account over the past 8 months. The money was supposedly dispersed in cash grants to anonymous recipients. But there were no anonymous recipients, were there, Brenda? The room grew so quiet I could hear the erratic, frantic beating of my mother's heart. Marcus Sr. stared at the screen, his eyes narrowing in utter confusion. Grandpa Elijah stepped closer to the archway, his posture going rigid. He had donated the land that church was built on, and his disgust was becoming palpable. I traced the routing numbers attached to these so-called anonymous cash dispersals. I continued, my voice rising with absolute authority. They did not go to struggling families. They did not go to the local food bank. Every single automated transfer bypassed the church accounts and dropped directly into a private offshore holding account registered in the Cayman Islands. The exact same offshore account Chloe uses to buy her custom Milan boots and white fur coats. Chloe let out a strangled gasp. She grabbed the edge of the console table, her knuckles turning stark white. She had been systematically skimming from a charity fund to subsidize her luxury shopping habits while her husband's startup hemorrhaged money. "But the theft is not even the most repulsive part of this story," I said, stepping directly into my mother's personal space, forcing her to look me in the eye. "You discovered Chloe's embezzlement 3 months ago. As head of the finance committee, you saw the glaring discrepancies. You saw the routing numbers. You knew exactly what your precious daughter-in-law was doing." Brenda was openly weeping, now tears carving dark trails of mascara down her pale cheeks. She shook her head frantically, begging me silently to stop talking, but I had absolutely no mercy left to give. "Instead of reporting the theft to the police and holding Chloe accountable, you decided to protect the sacred family image," I stated, my tone dripping with lethal contempt. "You could not let the country club know your son married a common thief, so you doctored the ledgers. And worse, you needed a scapegoat. You needed someone the congregation would readily blame." I tapped the screen one final time, displaying a scanned copy of a termination letter and a police report. You blame the missing $75,000 on Sarah Jenkins, I said, saying the name loud enough to ensure the hidden microphones captured every single syllable. Sarah was a low-income single mother of 3 who worked 2 jobs just to afford rent. She trusted you. She cleaned the church offices at night to make extra money. You planted a fraction of the stolen cash in her locker, and you called the authorities. You stood in front of the congregation and cried fake tears about how betrayed you felt by her actions. You ruined an innocent woman's life. You had her fired, evicted, and publicly humiliated just to ensure your elite social circle never found out your family was drowning in debt. Grandpa Elijah slammed his cane against the hardwood floor. The loud crack sounded like a gunshot. "You vile, wicked woman!" he roared, staring at Brenda with a hatred so pure it seemed to scorch the air in the room. "You destroyed a struggling mother to protect a parasite. You are no longer welcome under this roof." The absolute magnitude of the crimes displayed on the wall finally crashed down on the room. Federal wire fraud, bank fraud, embezzlement from a religious charity, framing an innocent civilian. The hidden cameras embedded in the crown molding were recording every piece of evidence, every confession, and every panicked reaction. The footage was already uploading to a secure cloud server completely out of their reach. Chloe realized the terrifying reality of her situation. She was staring at decades in a federal penitentiary. The luxurious life she had married into was a complete mirage, and the consequences were closing in fast. The survival instinct of a cornered rat suddenly took over her entire demeanor. She backed away from the family, her eyes darting frantically toward the front door. She turned her gaze onto Marcus Jr., who was still slumped in the leather chair weeping into his hands. Her expression twisted from panic into venomous self-preservation. She was ready to burn everyone in the room to save her own skin. "I did not know about the debt," Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing off the marble floors. "I did not know the company was bankrupt. Marcus lied to me. He told me the charity money was a legitimate dividend payment from his investors. He forced me to make those transfers." She grabbed her designer purse from the console table, her hands shaking violently. "I am not taking the fall for your pathetic failures, Marcus. I am leaving." Chloe spun on the heels of her custom Italian boots and lunged toward the sweeping mahogany staircase. Her trembling hands scrambled to gather the various designer bags she had carelessly tossed aside only moments earlier. She snatched up her Birkin, dragging it against the marble floor before whirling back around to face us. Tears were already streaming down her face, ruining her immaculate makeup, but these were not tears of genuine remorse. They were weapons. The notorious white tears of a woman who had spent her entire life weaponizing her fragility against anyone who dared hold her accountable. She pressed a perfectly manicured hand against her chest, taking exaggerated, shuddering breaths as she retreated toward the entryway. "I was manipulated," she cried out, her voice shaking with an expertly crafted blend of terror and innocence. "I am the real victim here. I married into this nightmare without knowing the truth. You are a toxic black family, and you dragged me into your twisted, dysfunctional web. I had absolutely no idea what Marcus was doing with those bank accounts. He controlled all the finances. I was just a naive wife following her husband." She wiped a single tear from her cheek, glaring at my brother with undisguised contempt. "You people used me." Marcus Jr. stared at his wife with his mouth hanging open, utterly paralyzed by her sudden betrayal. Brenda and Marcus Sr. looked equally shell-shocked, watching the woman they had constantly praised as the perfect high society addition to their family completely turn on them. Chloe did not wait for their reaction. She hoisted her heavy leather bags onto her slender shoulders and marched purposefully toward the grand double doors leading out to the circular driveway. She actually believed her pathetic performance had worked. She thought she could just cry crocodile tears, throw her husband entirely under the bus, and walk away into the freezing night completely unscathed. I moved faster than she did. I stepped directly into her path, planting myself firmly in front of the massive oak doors. My posture was relaxed, but my gaze was entirely unyielding. "Move out of my way, Kendra," she hissed, her voice dropping its fragile tremble and taking on a sharp, venomous edge. "You have destroyed your own family tonight. You have ruined your brother." I am not letting you ruin me too. Step aside before I call my lawyers and sue you for unlawful detainment. I did not budge a single inch. You are not going anywhere, Chloe, I replied, my voice perfectly calm and steady against her rising hysteria. And you can save the fragile victim routine for someone who does not know exactly who you truly are behind closed doors. I reached into the front pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen, opening the secure audio file I had downloaded from the hidden lockbox Grandpa Elijah had entrusted to me months ago. You claim Marcus masterminded this entire operation? I said, holding the phone up so the speaker faced her directly. You claim you were just a naive, helpless pawn caught in our so-called toxic web. Let us see what the actual evidence has to say about your stunning innocence. I pressed play. The pristine audio quality filled the silent foyer, broadcasting a conversation recorded just 6 weeks prior. Chloe's own voice echoed through the room, sharp, arrogant, and entirely devoid of any fragile victimhood. Marcus, you are being an absolute coward, her recorded voice sneered over the speaker. The old man can barely remember what he had for breakfast. Just bring me the primary guarantor forms from the estate portfolio. I spent 3 hours practicing his signature yesterday and I have it down perfectly. The bank executives will never question it. They are too busy kissing your father's ring to scrutinize the paperwork. Just hand me the damn pen and let me handle it. The recording continued, capturing the distinct sound of paper rustling and a heavy pen scratching against a hard surface. There it is, done, the recorded Chloe announced with a cruel, triumphant laugh. We are robbing the old man blind, and he is going to die in that depressing bedroom completely oblivious. We will be sipping champagne in Monaco by the time the bank even realizes the money is gone. I paused the audio and lowered my phone. The crushing silence that followed was absolute. Chloe stood frozen, her face entirely devoid of color, her designer bag slipping off her shoulders and crashing onto the marble floor. The white tears had completely dried up. The victim narrative was entirely obliterated. She was staring at her own undeniable guilt. Marcus Jr. looked at his wife with an expression of pure revulsion, finally realizing that the woman he had defended against his own sister was the very architect of his absolute destruction. Brenda covered her face with her hands, weeping softly into her palms, while Marcus Sr. simply stared at the floor, utterly defeated. Grandpa Elijah watched Chloe with eyes as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. You forged my signature, you vile creature, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that shook the room. You stole my legacy and laughed about my death. You will not walk away from this. Chloe opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The arrogant high society princess had finally been stripped of every single lie she had ever told. She took a trembling step backward, backing away from the door and stumbling over her own discarded luggage. The absolute finality of her ruin hung heavily in the freezing air of the foyer. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing sound shattered the heavy silence. The heavy brass doorbell rang, echoing loudly through the grand estate. Instantly, piercing blue and red lights began to flash violently through the frosted glass panels of the front door, illuminating Chloe's terrified face. This was the end. She could not escape. It was over. The heavy oak doors swung open before anyone inside the foyer could even reach for the brass handle. 2 local police officers stepped over the threshold, bringing the biting winter chill directly into the stifling heat of the grand entryway. The sudden gust of freezing wind swept through the vaulted space, causing the glass pendants on the massive chandelier to clink together in a soft, chaotic rhythm. Right behind the local officers stood 2 federal agents clad in dark tactical windbreakers with golden badges gleaming brightly under the foyer lights. Their imposing presence instantly shattered whatever lingering illusion of untouchable wealth my family was still desperately clinging to. They moved into the house with a synchronized, calculated precision that made the opulent surroundings feel entirely irrelevant. Chloe did not waste a single second. The moment the polished black boots of the local officers hit the imported marble floor, her entire demeanor violently shifted. The venomous sneer she had just aimed at me completely vanished. The sharp defensive posture evaporated into thin air. She threw her hands up to her face, smudging her mascara even further, and deliberately let out a high-pitched, trembling wail. She practically threw herself toward the nearest uniform, stumbling perfectly, as if her legs were giving out from sheer, overwhelming terror. "Help me!" she sobbed, grabbing the dark fabric of the closest officer's sleeve. "Thank God you are here. You have to get me out of this house right now. They are holding me hostage." The officer gently but firmly detached her manicured grip from his uniform, taking a tactical step backward to maintain his perimeter. Chloe barely registered his professional distance. She was far too committed to her impromptu performance. She spun around, pointing a shaking, accusing finger directly at Marcus Jr. and then aggressively jabbing it toward me. "They are crazy!" she cried out, her voice reaching a frantic, hysterical pitch designed to command absolute sympathy. "This entire family is completely unhinged. They trapped me in here and refused to let me leave. My husband forced me to sign those bank documents against my will. I did not know what they were doing. They are a toxic, terrifying family, and they have been manipulating me from the very beginning. I am just a naive wife. I was terrified for my life." It was a masterful display of weaponized fragility. She was desperately deploying every single prejudice trope she could muster, hoping the authorities would take one look at her tear-stained face and immediately arrest the intimidating black family she claimed was terrorizing her. She wanted them to see a helpless, distressed victim surrounded by aggressive criminals. She wanted her white tears to act as an impenetrable shield against federal indictment. She truly believed her affluent appearance and practiced vulnerability would automatically grant her immunity from the consequences of her own actions. But the authorities were not looking at us with suspicion. They were looking at her with absolute clinical detachment. The lead federal agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a severe, unyielding expression, stepped forward. He did not offer Chloe a comforting shoulder to cry on. He did not cast a wary glance in my direction or reach for his weapon. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his dark windbreaker. "Ma'am, I need you to step back and lower your voice," the agent instructed, his tone completely devoid of any comfort or sympathy. Chloe blinked, her fake sobs catching awkwardly in her throat. She looked at the agent, clearly confused as to why her performance was not yielding the immediate rescue she had anticipated. "You do not understand," she stammered, taking another desperate step toward him. "They are trying to frame me for their crimes." Kendra locked the door. She would not let me out. "I did not lock anything," I stated calmly, my hands resting casually in the pockets of my tailored blazer. "I simply stood in the entryway. And as for framing her, I think the audio file I submitted to your field office this morning speaks for itself, Agent Miller." Agent Miller offered me a brief professional nod. He had been reviewing the contents of Grandpa Elijah's digital lockbox since 9 o'clock that morning. He had heard every forged document strategy session, every boastful recorded confession, and every cruel laugh Chloe and Marcus Jr. had shared while dismantling my grandfather's estate. The entire investigation had been quietly building for weeks, culminating in this exact moment. Marcus Jr. pressed his back against the living room archway, looking like he might physically vomit. He stared at his wife, watching her attempt to sell him out to federal authorities without a second thought. The golden child of the Addams family was finally realizing that the ruthless ambition he had prized so highly in his partner was now pointed directly at his own throat. Brenda remained completely paralyzed on the velvet sofa, her hands covering her mouth. She was staring at the police officers with wide, unblinking eyes, undoubtedly wondering if they were also carrying a warrant for her arrest regarding the Grace Fellowship church funds. The sheer terror of public exposure had essentially turned her to stone. Grandpa Elijah stood tall beside me, leaning his weight onto his polished oak cane. He watched the frantic, desperate flailing of his grandson's wife with the quiet dignity of a man who had survived far worse storms than this. He had fought too hard and sacrificed too much to secure his family's future, only to have it squandered by entitled parasites. He had built an empire through honest sweat and relentless grit, and he was not going to let an arrogant thief tear it down. Chloe looked wildly between the stoic federal agents and the silent local police officers. The complete lack of a sympathetic audience finally caused her manufactured panic to give way to genuine raw fear. She backed away, her designer heels slipping slightly on the slick marble floor. She looked at the heavy oak doors, realizing the path to freedom was permanently blocked. Agent Miller unfolded the crisp legal document he had pulled from his jacket. The harsh rustle of the paper sounded deafening in the quiet foyer. He held it up, ensuring the official seal was clearly visible under the bright, recessed lighting. He did not shout. He did not need to. His voice carried the absolute, undeniable weight of federal authority. Chloe Adams, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud and elder financial abuse. The handcuffs click around her wrists. The metallic snap of the steel restraints echoed with horrifying finality. For a fraction of a second, Chloe stood perfectly still, staring down at her confined wrists, as if they belonged to a stranger. Then the absolute reality of her situation shattered her temporary paralysis. She erupted into a primal, ear-piercing shriek that forced the nearest officer to visibly flinch. She fought against the federal agents, twisting her shoulders and kicking her custom Italian boots against the polished marble floor. The manicured facade she had meticulously maintained for years dissolved completely, leaving behind a wild, thrashing animal. "Get your hands off me," she screamed, her voice tearing at the seams. "I am Chloe Adams. You cannot do this to me. I have lawyers. I have money. Marcus, do something. Tell them I had nothing to do with this." The agents did not hesitate or offer a single word of comfort. They moved with practiced efficiency, gripping her arms firmly and marching her toward the open front door. Chloe dug her heels into the expensive imported rug, leaving deep, jagged drag marks in the woven fabric. Her desperate pleas morphed into a vile string of curses aimed directly at my brother. "You spineless, pathetic loser!" she spat over her shoulder as the agents forced her across the threshold. "I am going to tell them everything, every single fraudulent wire transfer, every fake corporate expense account, every stolen dime. You are going to rot in a cell right next to me, Marcus." The heavy oak doors finally swung shut, cutting off her frantic threats. The flashing red and blue lights slowly faded from the frosted glass panels, leaving the foyer plunging back into a suffocatingly quiet gloom. Marcus Jr. did not move to defend his wife. He did not call out to her or dial his attorneys. He simply crumpled. His knees gave out beneath him, and he collapsed onto the hardwood floor like a puppet with its strings suddenly severed. He buried his face in trembling hands, letting out a low, guttural sob that sounded entirely unrecognizable. The golden boy of the Adams dynasty, the brilliant entrepreneur who had looked down his nose at everyone who lacked his supposed genius, was reduced to a weeping, pathetic mess on the floor of his childhood home. He rocked back and forth, muttering incoherent apologies to no one in particular. Brenda rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside him. She wrapped her arms tightly around his shaking shoulders, murmuring soothing, empty promises into his ear. She stroked his hair, treating the grown man like a terrified toddler, completely ignoring the magnitude of the crimes that had just been exposed. But Marcus Sr. did not offer comfort. He turned his attention away from his broken son and locked his gaze entirely on me. His face was a terrifying shade of crimson, and the thick vein pulsing on his forehead looked ready to burst. The shock of the evening had finally worn off, replaced by a blinding, violent rage. He marched across the room, closing the distance between us, until he was standing mere inches from my face. He wanted to intimidate me. He wanted to use his imposing physical presence to force me back into the obedient, subservient role I had occupied for the first 2 decades of my life. But I did not shrink away. I held my ground, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely blank. "You ungrateful, treacherous snake," he roared, his voice shaking the crystal pendants on the chandelier above us. "You planned this entire ambush just to humiliate us. You brought federal agents to my front door." I watched the spit fly from his lips as he screamed. "You are completely dead to me, Kendra. Do you hear me? You are no longer a part of this family. You have single-handedly destroyed the Adams legacy because you were too bitter and jealous to accept your proper place. He pointed a trembling finger toward the foyer, his eyes wild with unfocused fury. I want you out of my sight. I want you out of this family, and most importantly, I want you off my property right now. Get out of my house before I have you physically thrown out. The sheer audacity of his demand was almost amusing. Even now, standing amidst the total wreckage of his fraudulent empire, he still desperately clung to the illusion of absolute control. He actually believed he still possessed the authority to banish me from the kingdom he had built on a foundation of lies and stolen equity. He thought the grand walls of the estate still belonged to him. He thought his booming voice still carried the weight of a patriarch. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic shouting. I did not offer a defensive explanation or a bitter retort. I simply looked at him with a profound, icy pity. I reached into the leather tote bag resting against my hip and pulled out a single crisp piece of paper. It was not a bank statement or a corporate ledger. It was a formal legal document stamped and notarized by the county clerk just 3 days prior. I held the document up, ensuring the bold black lettering at the top was perfectly visible under the ambient lighting. Marcus Sr.'s furious ranting abruptly died in his throat as his eyes landed on the official seal. He blinked rapidly, his brain struggling to process the information presented to him. The righteous anger drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly pale realization. He reached out with a trembling hand, but I kept the paper just out of his grasp. I smoothly extended my arm and pressed the thick parchment directly against his cashmere sweater, forcing him to take it. It's my property now, I said smoothly. And you have exactly 30 days to clear out before I bulldoze it to build a community center. The paper trembled in his grip as the black ink spelling out his impending homelessness refused to change. Marcus Sr. stared at the eviction notice with wide, unblinking eyes, while the sheer magnitude of his defeat settled over him like a suffocating shroud. His jaw worked soundlessly up and down, struggling to formulate a response to the absolute destruction of his carefully curated kingdom. The sprawling estate he had used to lord his false superiority over his peers was no longer his fortress. It was just a temporary holding cell waiting for a wrecking ball. The realization struck him with physical force, causing him to stagger backward and brace himself against the mahogany credenza. He looked at me, his face entirely devoid of its usual arrogant bluster, replaced by a pathetic, desperate panic. When he realized my expression offered absolutely zero mercy, he violently twisted his body toward the one man he believed still held ultimate authority. He lunged toward Grandpa Elijah, his hands outstretched in a frantic, pleading gesture. "Dad, you have to stop this madness!" He begged, his voice cracking, as he grabbed the sleeve of my grandfather's tailored suit. "You are the head of this family. You are the patriarch. You cannot let her do this to us. She is stealing our home. She is tearing down the legacy we built together. Command her to tear up this ridiculous notice right now. Tell her to transfer the deed back into my name where it belongs. She has to listen to you. You cannot just stand there and let a disrespectful child humiliate her own father and throw him out onto the street like common trash. We have a reputation to maintain in this city. What will the board members think? What will the country club say when they find out she is bulldozing the Adams estate for a cheap community center? You have to fix this, Dad. You have to put her in her place before she ruins our family name forever." The silence that followed his frantic plea was absolute and terrifying. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a catastrophic storm. Grandpa Elijah did not immediately pull his arm away. He simply lowered his gaze to where his son's trembling fingers were clutching his sleeve. He stared at that grip for a long, agonizing moment before raising his eyes to meet Marcus Sr.'s desperate stare. The look on my grandfather's face was not one of anger or outrage. It was something far worse. It was profound, unadulterated disgust. It was the look of a man staring at a festering wound that had finally become too rotten to save. He slowly, deliberately peeled his son's fingers off his jacket, brushing the fabric as if removing something foul and contagious. He adjusted his stance, planting his oak cane firmly against the marble floor before he spoke. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the foyer. "You dare speak to me about our family name?" he asked, his tone dripping with an icy contempt that made Marcus Sr. flinch. "You dare invoke the concept of legacy after what I have witnessed tonight? You have no legacy, Marcus. You have a mountain of expensive debts and a hollow facade built on the backs of better people. I spent my entire life breaking my back so you would never have to know the sting of poverty. I gave you every opportunity to build a real dynasty of substance and honor. And what did you do with those blessings? You squandered them on designer suits and the fleeting approval of shallow socialites. You traded genuine respect for cheap validation. You became a hollow shell obsessed with pretending to be a king, while your own son and his viper of a wife were busy robbing me blind right under your nose. But your absolute worst sin was not your staggering financial incompetence or your pathetic desperate need for status. He continued, his voice rising with righteous fury. Your unforgivable crime was how you treated this brilliant, capable young woman standing right here. He pointed a steady finger toward me without looking away from Marcus Sr. You threw your own flesh and blood to the wolves. You belittled Kendra, dismissed her achievements, and demanded she shrink herself down, just so your weak, mediocre son could feel taller. You allowed that vile criminal Chloe to disrespect your daughter in her own home. A real father protects his children equally. A real man recognizes strength and honors it. You are neither. You are a coward who enabled thieves just to keep peace at your dinner table. Therefore, as of this exact moment, you are no longer my son. I officially disown you. You have no claim to my name, my estate, or my protection. You are entirely on your own. Marcus Sr. staggered backward, staring blindly at the man he had spent his entire life trying to impress. He opened his mouth, but the crushing finality of his father's judgment left him speechless. The absolute public rejection from the patriarch entirely destroyed his manufactured superiority in a single instant. He looked around the grand foyer, searching frantically for any remaining shred of his former power. But there was absolutely nothing left to save him. He was broken, exposed, and entirely alone. He slowly lowered his head, slumping in defeat. Grandpa Elijah was not finished. He tapped his cane sharply. "There is just one final piece of business we need to conclude tonight, Marcus," he stated coldly. "Reach into your pocket and hand over the keys to that luxury Mercedes." Marcus Sr. panicked. "The car?" he stammered. "How will I leave?" "Walk," Grandpa Elijah replied. "You spent years bragging about paying cash for that vehicle. Did you really think I would never notice you secretly charging the lease payments to my account? You never owned it. It was leased under my name. Hand over the keys." Marcus Sr.'s hand trembled violently as he reached into the pocket of his slacks. The heavy silver key fob bearing the iconic luxury emblem felt like a lead weight in his palm. He pulled it out, staring at it as if he had never seen it before. With a jerky, defeated motion, he tossed the keys toward Grandpa Elijah. They landed on the marble floor with a sharp clatter, sliding to a halt against the tip of the old man's polished cane. Without uttering another syllable, my father turned his back on us and trudged heavily toward the grand staircase, looking like a man marching toward the gallows. His retreat left a vacuum in the massive foyer, quickly filled by the pathetic sound of Marcus Jr. continuing to sob on the floor. Brenda still knelt beside him, her expensive silk dress pooling around her knees as she desperately tried to shush his embarrassing wails. I watched my older brother heave and gasp for air, feeling an absolute void where sibling affection should have been. For years, he had paraded around as the untouchable heir apparent, treating me like an annoying stain on his immaculate reputation. Now he was just a mess of ruined arrogance clutching his mother's arm. I looked back at the eviction notice still clutched in my hand. 30 days felt entirely too generous for the man who had actively conspired to rob our grandfather blind. I stepped closer to the crumpled figure on the floor, my leather boots clicking sharply against the stone. The sound forced Brenda to look up, her face a mask of pleading terror. She knew she had zero leverage left. Marcus Jr. finally lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot and swollen, his perfectly styled hair now a chaotic mess. He looked at me, expecting the same leniency I had just afforded our father. He assumed the 30-day grace period naturally extended to him. He was sorely mistaken. "You do not get 30 days, Marcus," I stated, my voice echoing clearly through the vaulted space. "You do not even get 30 minutes. His brow furrowed in genuine confusion as he wiped a trail of snot from his upper lip. "What are you talking about?" He stammered, his voice hoarse and broken. "I live here. This is my home too. You cannot just throw me out into the freezing cold without notice. There are laws, Kendra. You have to give me legal notice." I smiled, a cold, razor-sharp expression that held absolutely no warmth. "That is the fascinating thing about your relentless tax-dodging schemes," I replied, crossing my arms over my chest. "You officially changed your primary residence over a year ago to exploit a corporate tax loophole. Your legal address is registered as the third-floor suite of your startup headquarters downtown. You remember that building, right? The one you heavily mortgaged to fund Chloe's lavish lifestyle." Marcus Jr. visibly paled, his mouth dropping open as the realization began to dawn on him. He had thought he was a genius for hiding his personal assets behind corporate doors. He had bragged about it at a family dinner, calling me a financially illiterate amateur for not utilizing similar offshore strategies. Now that exact arrogance was locking the jaws of the trap. "I bought the distressed debt on that commercial property 3 weeks ago," I continued, letting the words land with heavy, deliberate impact. "Your startup has been bleeding capital for 18 months straight. The holding company holding your primary residence mortgage defaulted. As the primary debt holder, I seized the commercial property this morning. You no longer have an office. You no longer have a startup. And because you deliberately stripped yourself of residential rights at this estate, you are legally classified as a trespasser right now. Get out!" Brenda let out a strangled gasp, clutching her son's arm tighter. "Kendra? You cannot be serious," she pleaded, tears finally spilling over her expertly contoured cheeks. "It is the middle of winter. The temperature is dropping below freezing. He has nowhere to go. Chloe took all his credit cards and his bank accounts are frozen by the federal investigators. He does not even have a coat." I stared down at the woman who had spent 2 decades turning a blind eye to my suffering just to maintain her own comfort. I offered no sympathy. "That sounds like a personal problem," I said, dismissing her entirely. Marcus Jr. scrambled to his feet, swaying unsteadily. He looked at the front door, then back at me, sheer desperation flashing in his eyes. The reality of his total destitution was finally sinking in. He had no wife, no company, no home, and absolutely no safety net. He took a hesitant, trembling step toward me, holding out his shaking hands like a beggar on the street corner. "Kendra, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "I am sorry. I was stupid. I let Chloe manipulate me into making terrible decisions. I have absolutely nothing left. My car was seized this morning. My phone was taken by the agents as evidence. Just let me stay in the basement tonight. I will sleep on the concrete floor. I just need a place to figure things out." When I remained completely silent, his pleading grew even more frantic. He dropped his hands, rubbing his arms against the chill already seeping through the walls. "Just give me cab fare." Then he pleaded, tears streaming down his face. "Just enough to get to a cheap motel or the bus station. You cannot just leave me stranded with zero cash. Please, Kendra, just a little help." I reached into the front pocket of my trousers. I pulled out exactly 3/4 and 2 dimes, tossing them onto the marble floor at his feet. The coins bounced and rattled. "That is 85 cents. The exact amount you threw at me when I begged for help buying my college textbooks. Get walking." Marcus Jr. stared at the loose change scattered across the polished stone, as if the silver coins were burning embers. He did not say another word. He scooped up the meager offering with trembling fingers, tucked his pathetic tail between his shaking legs, and trudged out into the freezing winter night, leaving the heavy oak doors to finally click shut behind him. By the time New Year's Day rolled around, the grand Adams estate was entirely emptied of their presence. The sprawling mansion felt lighter, devoid of the suffocating pretension that had choked its halls for decades. I sat in the sunlit breakfast nook, sipping black coffee and watching the winter frost melt off the expansive lawn. While my morning was wrapped in absolute serenity, the world outside was burning down around my former family. The carefully constructed house of cards had not just collapsed, it had completely incinerated. The elite social circles they had sacrificed their own daughter to impress were now feasting on their spectacular ruin. Gossip in high society moves faster than a wildfire, and the explosive details of Chloe's arrest my grandfather's blistering disownment and the subsequent evictions had become the sole topic of conversation at every exclusive holiday gala in the city. The illusion of their untouchable wealth and moral superiority was entirely shattered overnight, leaving them exposed to the merciless judgment of the very people they had desperately tried to emulate. Brenda was the first to experience the crushing weight of public disgrace. For 20 years, she had reigned supreme as the undisputed queen of the Grace Fellowship Church. She had used her position on the finance committee to sit in the front pew wrapped in designer silk, silently judging anyone who failed to meet her impossible standards of holy perfection. That righteous facade was violently ripped away when the federal investigation into Marcus Jr.'s accounts inevitably bled into her own financial records. The embezzlement cover-up was exposed in glaring detail. She had actively helped her son launder stolen estate money through the church's charitable donation fund, writing it off as anonymous tithes to avoid IRS scrutiny. Her phone began ringing at dawn on New Year's Day and simply did not stop. It was not her loyal prayer group calling to wish her blessings for the coming year. It was a relentless barrage of outraged church elders, deacons, and former friends demanding answers. They wanted to know how she could steal from the congregation while preaching about integrity from the pulpit. Brenda sat in the cramped two-bedroom apartment she was now renting on a month-to-month lease, staring at the vibrating phone with wide, terrified eyes. The prominent, highly respected church matriarch had been officially excommunicated. She was entirely radioactive, and the women she had gossiped with for decades were now gleefully blocking her number. Marcus Sr. was faring no better. The man who had defined his entire existence by the prestige of his country club membership was learning a brutal lesson about conditional loyalty. He had assumed his wealthy golf buddies would rally around him. He thought he could spin a narrative casting himself as the tragic victim of an ungrateful, mentally unstable daughter and a senile father. On New Year's morning, he put on his best tailored suit, drove his cheap rental car to the Oakmont Elite Country Club, and swaggered up to the Mahogany Bar, expecting his usual warm reception. The silence that fell over the room when he entered was deafening. Men he had shared expensive scotch with for 15 years suddenly found their shoes incredibly interesting. When he approached his regular table, the group of executives sitting there actively turned their backs to him. The club manager, a man Marcus Sr. had routinely undertipped and talked down to, approached him with a tight professional smile and a sealed envelope. It was a formal notice of immediate membership termination, citing a failure to uphold the moral and financial standards of the institution. Marcus Sr. was escorted off the premises by a polite but firm security guard, walking past the large bay windows, where his former friends watched his humiliating departure with undisguised contempt. His elite status was permanently revoked. The reality of his absolute social exile hit him like a physical blow. He returned to the cramped apartment, pacing the cheap carpeted floors like a caged animal. He had no company to run, no mansion to flaunt, and no sycophants left to stroke his massive, fragile ego. His bank accounts were frozen, his legacy was ashes, and the silence from his peers was deafening. Desperation makes arrogant men do incredibly foolish things. At precisely 3 in the afternoon, my smartphone buzzed on the kitchen counter, breaking the quiet peace of my new home. The caller ID flashed with my father's name. I let it ring 3 times before calmly tapping the screen and lifting the device to my ear. I did not offer a greeting. The heavy breathing on the other end of the line was loud and erratic, betraying his frantic mental state. Kendra, he began, his voice attempting to project a commanding authority that completely failed to land. I have spent the last few days reflecting on the unfortunate events of the past month. I am willing to be the bigger person here. I am willing to forgive your disrespectful outburst and welcome you back into the family fold. I rolled my eyes at his sheer delusional audacity. He was practically living in a cardboard box, yet he still thought he held the high ground. But forgiveness requires restitution. He continued, his tone shifting from fake benevolence to sharp, demanding greed. You humiliated me. You took my home. If you want my forgiveness, you are going to transfer $3 million into an offshore account I have set up. A multi-million-dollar stipend is the only way you can make this right and finally prove that you still respect your powerful father and his legacy. The sheer audacity of his demand hung in the air, filling the silence with a thick, suffocating delusion. I did not immediately respond. Instead, I turned away from the sprawling kitchen island and walked slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown penthouse. The panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline stretched out before me, a glittering tapestry of glass and steel that I now owned a significant piece of. Down there, in the damp winter chill, Marcus Sr. was clinging to the rotting fragments of a shattered illusion. Up here, the air was crisp, clean, and entirely under my control. He actually believed he still possessed something I wanted. He truly thought his forgiveness was a commodity I was willing to purchase for $3 million. The realization that he had learned absolutely nothing from his spectacular downfall would have been tragic if it had not been so entirely predictable. I took a slow, measured sip of my coffee, letting the rich, dark roast ground me in the present reality before issuing my response. You are not a powerful father, Marcus. I stated, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional inflection. You are a bankrupt trespasser calling me from a prepaid burner phone because federal investigators seized your primary device. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. He had expected me to argue defensively. He had anticipated a screaming match filled with tears and bitter accusations to validate his warped sense of importance. He wanted a chaotic emotional reaction because chaos was the only environment where his manipulation could still function. But I denied him that twisted satisfaction. I spoke with the icy, absolute authority of a chief executive officer addressing a terminated employee. You have no legacy left to respect. I continued, my tone remaining dangerously quiet and relentlessly steady. You squandered your inheritance on country club dues and luxury car leases, trying to impress men who abandoned you the very second your bank accounts froze. You allowed your arrogant son to steal from the only man who ever truly supported this family. You enabled a culture of profound entitlement that ultimately poisoned every single relationship you ever had. And now, standing amidst the total wreckage of your own disastrous financial decisions, you have the colossal nerve to ask me for a stipend. My forgiveness is not for sale, Kendra. He snapped back, his voice trembling with a violent mixture of rage and terror. You will regret turning your back on your blood. I do not want your forgiveness, I replied smoothly, cutting through his pathetic threats. I do not want your approval, your guidance, or your empty conditional love. I want you to listen very carefully to the next words I say, because I will never repeat them. As of 9 o'clock this morning, my legal team filed a comprehensive cease and desist order against you, Brenda Marcus Jr. and Chloe. You are strictly prohibited from coming within 500 feet of my residence, my corporate headquarters, or any property owned by the Adams Holding Company. You are legally barred from contacting any of my vendors, partners, or board members under any circumstances. You have zero access to the trust funds, the offshore accounts, or the emergency reserves. I have fortified every single financial boundary and placed ironclad firewalls around my entire empire. You are completely locked out of the kingdom you once claimed to rule. If you attempt to circumvent these strict legal boundaries, my attorneys will immediately press charges for harassment and extortion. If you show up at my lobby, the security team has standing orders to have you promptly arrested for trespassing. This is not a negotiation tactic. This is a final binding directive. He tried to speak again, his voice raising to a frantic, desperate shout that echoed tinny and hollow through the speaker. Kendra, you cannot do this to us. We are your family. You owe us your loyalty. You owe me everything. I did not let him finish the pathetic sentence. I lowered the phone from my ear, watching the high-resolution screen glow with the active call timer. I felt no lingering guilt or residual sadness weighing down my conscience. The heavy, suffocating weight of his expectations had completely evaporated, leaving behind a profound, undeniable freedom that filled my lungs. I tapped the red button, instantly severing the connection and cutting off his frantic pleading mid-syllable. Without a single second of hesitation, I navigated to the contact settings and permanently blocked the number. I did the exact same thing for Brenda Marcus Jr. and every known associate they might try to use as an intermediary. The digital barrier was now absolute, mirroring the physical and emotional walls I had meticulously constructed around my new life. I set the phone face down on the marble countertop and took a deep, cleansing breath. The silence in the penthouse was not lonely or isolating. It was the beautiful, resonant sound of total liberation. The toxic chapter of my life was officially closed forever. I turned back toward the expansive glass doors leading out to the wraparound terrace. The winter sun was beginning to dip below the distant horizon, casting a brilliant golden glow over the bustling city below. The sliding glass door slid open with a soft metallic hum. Grandpa Elijah stepped out onto the balcony, his posture perfectly straight, and his eyes sparkling with a vibrant, renewed energy. The heavy, miserable burden of his son's devastating betrayal had finally lifted from his broad shoulders, taking a full decade of age and exhaustion with it. He looked significantly healthier and genuinely happier than I had seen him in years. He leaned casually against the tempered glass railing, taking in the magnificent view of the corporate empire we had successfully secured together. He turned his head toward me, a proud, genuine smile spreading across his weathered face. "Are you ready for dinner, CEO?" I turned to face my grandfather, a genuine smile breaking across my face for the very first time in what felt like a lifetime. "I am more than ready," I replied, taking his arm and leading him back inside the warm, brightly lit penthouse. 6 months flew by with the breathtaking speed of a high-speed train, completely unburdened by extra weight. The changing of the seasons brought a profound sense of justice that settled over the city like a cleansing rain. The Addams family name, once a shield used to bludgeon the innocent and excuse the wicked, had become a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of power. The transition from chaotic survival to absolute stability was remarkable. Chloe was the very first to face the absolute reality of her actions. Federal prosecutors did not care about her designer wardrobe or her practiced tearful victim routine. She was currently serving a 10-year sentence in a minimum security correctional facility. I occasionally saw headlines about her highly publicized trial detailing how she traded her custom Italian boots for a standard-issue khaki uniform. She spent her days working in the prison laundry room, folding sheets and scrubbing stains. It was a perfectly poetic downgrade for a woman who had built her entire identity on refusing to lift a single manicured finger for anyone else. Her attempts to seduce the legal team into a plea deal had failed spectacularly, resulting in the maximum penalty allowed by law. Marcus Jr.'s spectacular fall from grace was a brutal lesson in hubris. Stripped of his fake corporate titles and my grandfather's endless financial bailouts, his supposed genius evaporated instantly. To pay off the massive court-ordered restitution for his embezzlement, he was forced to take the only job that would hire a disgraced, bankrupt former executive facing multiple felony fraud convictions. He was currently working the overnight shift at a fast food drive-through window on the bleakest outskirts of the city. He spent his nights wearing a polyester uniform and a paper hat, handing greasy bags of fries to intoxicated teenagers and exhausted truck drivers. He was earning minimum wage to slowly chip away at a staggering debt he would undoubtedly carry to his grave. There were no more luxury leased cars, no more offshore tax havens, and absolutely no more arrogant lectures about his inherent superiority. He was a broken man trapped in an endless cycle of menial labor and overwhelming regret. As for my parents, Marcus Sr. and Brenda, their punishment was perhaps the most agonizing because it was entirely social. They were living in a cramped, drafty, one-bedroom apartment situated directly above a notoriously noisy 24-hour laundromat. The elite social circles they had sacrificed their souls to impress had completely and utterly erased them from existence. Brenda could not even walk down the street to the local grocery store without facing the icy, judging glares of her former church members. She had traded her extravagant charity luncheons for clipping coupons and dodging bill collectors. Marcus Sr. spent his days sitting in a worn, second-hand armchair, staring blankly at a small television screen, entirely ignored by the country club friends who once treated his word as absolute gospel. They were ghosts haunting a city they used to rule, trapped in a prison of their own making, suffocating under the weight of their profound irrelevance. Their phone never rang with invitations to summer galas or winter balls. They were completely isolated. But none of their misery touched me. Their shadows no longer darkened my doorway. Tonight the penthouse was alive with the vibrant, joyful sounds of a chosen family. The long mahogany dining table was covered in an extravagant feast prepared by a private chef, featuring roasted duck truffle potatoes and perfectly seared asparagus. The crystal glasses clinked in genuine celebration, completely devoid of the toxic, passive-aggressive microaggressions that had plagued every single Addams family dinner I had ever endured. The air smelled of rich sauces and expensive wine, a sharp contrast to the bitter tension that used to ruin my appetite. I sat at the head of the table, flanked by the people who had truly supported me from the very beginning. To my right sat Grandpa Elijah, laughing robustly at a joke told by my lead project manager, Sarah, who had stood by my side during the darkest days of the corporate takeover. To my left was my closest friend, Maya, the brilliant architect who was actively designing the community center we were building on the ashes of my father's former estate. We shared stories of triumph and plans for the future. There were no tense silences, no cruel comparisons, and no one demanding that I shrink myself down to make them feel larger. We were surrounded by warmth, mutual respect, and authentic, unconditional love. Every smile was real, and every compliment was earned. After the final toast was raised and the decadent chocolate soufflés were cleared away, I slipped quietly out onto the wraparound terrace. The cool summer night air wrapped around me like a comforting embrace. I gripped the glass railing, looking out over the sprawling, glittering expanse of the Atlanta skyline. The towering skyscrapers pulsed with life, a vibrant testament to ambition and resilience. I had survived the emotional war zone of my childhood. I had outsmarted the thieves, dismantled the toxic empire, and rebuilt my life on a foundation of absolute truth and unwavering integrity. The journey had been brutal, but the destination was worth every single scar. I closed my eyes, listening to the joyful laughter drifting out from the dining room behind me. The heavy, suffocating chains of the Addams legacy were permanently broken. I was no longer the scapegoat or the forgotten daughter. I was a proud CEO, a true survivor, and the architect of my own magnificent destiny. I opened my eyes, staring at the endless horizon, feeling completely victorious, beautifully free, and profoundly, eternally at peace.